Well, here we go. Welcome to another episode of the Teens Armory podcast. In this episode, we are going to be talking about theological triage, how to disagree with other Christians. I'm Chris, and I'm here with Hayden. What's up, Hayden? How's your past month been?
Dude, has it been a month? I feel like has it been more or has it been less? Like it's been a good while though.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a while since we've done this. We're doing these less
hmm
frequently, I've
I know.
noticed, just because end of the school year,
I know. It's
busy
getting crazy,
stuff.
man. Things
Um,
are getting real.
yeah, things are getting real.
Yeah. And it's awesome. I mean, like we haven't done one of these in a while and we forget where the record button is when Zoom has to update and all that. Like, man,
Yeah, that's how you
like
know it's been a while.
that's how you know it's been a while. Yeah, I remember doing these notes over the freeze in February. But we've had this one in the back burner for a bit. We've done a few episodes before this one, so
Yeah,
um
yeah,
but
we have.
but but yeah, man, dude, it's crazy. Yeah. I mean, yeah, school is like really kicking in. I mean, it's like what, 5, 6 weeks left for us?
Yeah,
Man, that's crazy.
definitely.
That's crazy. That's like the last 5 weeks of high school. That's just, man, I don't know. It gets you thinking. It really does get you thinking.
Really does. So, one important topic that we wanted to discuss is the subject of disagreeing with other believers. So that's mostly what today's episode is going to be about. We're going to talk about this concept known as theological triage. Essentially, what you do is you categorize Christian beliefs into about three, maybe four different categories, and then there's the highest tier, which is our essential doctrines of the Christian faith. And then there's a second tier, which you have doctrines that are important to disagree over. Third tier are still important doctrines, but they're not worth dividing over. And then fourth tier are less important for the proclamation of the gospel. So we're going to go ahead and get into that. We're going to unpack that, starting off with who made this. Where did we get this term theological triage from? Hayden, do you know where we get this from?
Yeah, I think it was originally an Al Mohler quote. I think it because he describes so triage is a military term. Basically, when you have like three different injuries, so like a broken arm, someone's bleeding out, or someone's got a little scrape, there's something called triage where it's like, okay, we have to tend to one of them before the others, tend to the guy who's bleeding out before the person who has a broken arm, who was also before, the guy who has a little cut on his finger. And so it's describing like an order of importance almost. I think who the person who really made this famous or kind of brought it very mainstream is Gavin Ortland. He's a big YouTuber, big pastor. Actually, I don't know if he's pastor. Big theologian guy.
We quote him a lot.
Yeah, we do quote him a lot here. He's got some good quotes, and I think he's done a lot of work on this, and I think he's done a lot of good work on this. He has 2 books on this, several videos, and a whole ministry, and so. I think those are the kind of the main figures in all of this. I mean, there's definitely more voices, but I think it's important to know why. Why is this made? Well, um, and the two reasons why this is made is to avoid two dangers known as doctrinal sectarianism and doctrinal minimalism. Pretty much meaning you either have no unity or no urgency. So sectarianism makes everything like a bigger issue than it is. You can think of tribalism, and this is a bad thing because we are called to unify, especially on things that we should not divide over, like tertiary issues, like small things like um, the millennium and things like that. Like we should not be dividing over that. But a sectarianist would say, no, no, we do need to divide over everything. If you are in that tribe, I'm in this tribe, we're divided. And so it causes a lot of unnecessary damage. It makes mountains out of ant hills. It can destroy relationships. And so we are called to understanding, but also we need to understand, or sorry, we are called to unity, but we also need to understand where our disagreements come from, and we need to understand that there are disagreements. So there's a sense in which um, understanding the disagreement is good, but the way it's taken is false. And then there's doctrinal minimalism, and this makes everything not as big of an issue as it is. It's almost uncaring, and this is not true because we are called to stand firm, right? We're called to preach the gospel boldly, right? We're supposed to go out there and be doing these things and standing firm. Um, but minimalism will say, oh, well, it's just more of I don't need theology. I don't need this. That's just dividing the church. The problem is that doctrine is everywhere. Who is Jesus? That's doctrine. And that actually can divide,
Right.
you know? And so we are called to stand firm on things, but we also need to understand the ranking of urgency. So we need to fall between these two doctrines, right? Um, we need to balance the minimalism and the sectarianism. Oh my goodness, I can't speak today. And the way that we do this is through theological triage, which, like Chris said, the first rank is essential, the second rank is urgent, the third rank is important, and the fourth rank is unimportant. So I think it's kind of how it's put. A lot of my notes are drawn from Gavin Ortland's book, Finding the Right Hills to Die On, A Case for Theological Triage. So, very good book, very short.
Right, exactly, because we don't want to have it the pendulum swing too far in either direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a good, I think too, because a lot of the times when I first started studying theology, I didn't have a proper ranking of
Mm-hmm.
different Christian beliefs. So I went around thinking Calvinism was, extremely important, and everyone
Yeah,
needed
yeah,
to
yeah.
know my thoughts on Calvinism.
Cage
Being an
stage.
introvert, of course, I wasn't as terrible as I possibly could be, but
Yeah.
um, I definitely did think that, people speaking in tongues was one of the biggest threats to Christianity. And then I began to see more, okay, there's actually a lot bigger things at stake. There's
Mm-hmm.
the concept of the Trinity, there's the concept of God, theological liberalism, which leads to a faith that is meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of other threats to the faith. And these are the ones that we should address with much higher urgency. And then we go down the hill later, talking about other things like speaking in tongues.
All right. Well, it's time to define what are the primary doctrines. All right, let's listing some primary doctrines, kind of talk about what it means to be a primary doctrine. And so, Gavin Ortland says in his book on page 19 that first rank doctrines are essential to the gospel itself. Um, he also says on page 76, I think it's a good quote here. Some first rank doctrines we are needed to defend the gospel, and others to the problem. What's it called? I think it says what? To proclaim the gospel. Without them, the gospel is either vulnerable or incomplete. And so I think it's a good way of putting it is that we need first rank issues to not only to define the gospel, but also to strengthen it, to ward against heresy, right? And here's some important questions to consider when discovering primary doctrines. What is the biblical clarity on the topic? What is the gospel importance? What is the testimony of the historical church? And what is the effect on the church today? So, to put it simply, primary doctrines are those that are foundational to Christianity. Some would be doctrines such as God, the gospel, salvation by grace through faith, Christ, the virgin birth, the Trinity, and etc. So you can think of the early ecumenical creeds as a good source of primary doctrines because they were written to counter heresy. A lot of those creeds were written as here is what the church thinks, and you are outside of the church because of that. So you can look at the history of the creeds for that. Um, like Nicene and Apostles are two good examples. And so with this, we need an attitude of courage and conviction when it comes to primary doctrines. Now, the question always comes, is this essential to salvation? Did the thief on the cross, believe in the Trinity? Mormons would like to say, well, is heaven a theology test, right? Because they're like, well, we deny the Trinity, but are you saying heaven's a theology test? Well, we need to distinguish between what must be affirmed and what must not be denied. Now, not everyone's going to know everything. The thief on the cross did not know the intricacies of the Trinity, yet he was still given salvation. Why? Because he believed in God. And so there's a sense in which for salvation, um, we need to believe some things, but at the same time, things naturally come out of that. So if you were to go your whole life not believing the Trinity and calling yourself a Christian, like willfully denying the Trinity, that is a lot different than someone who never got to know it naturally, because it naturally flows out of their theology. And so that's the difference between someone who just may not know and a heretic. Um, and so yeah, that's the difference. You got anything to add, Chris?
Yeah, and I think um, understanding the difference is also very important for people to understand. Just knowing that this is what makes Christianity unique. This is what separates it from the others. Now, you don't have to have a perfectly clear view of the Trinity in order to make it to heaven. As Hayden was just saying, it's the things that must not be denied, or else you fall into heresy. And that is very dangerous because the three questions that we can ask in order to understand some of these primary doctrines, three good ones are: who is God, who is Christ, who is man? Um,
Mm.
if you believe God is, for example, three different gods, that is a heresy. You are believing in a different God. If you believe Christ was not really God the Son, or if you believe Christ was a spirit being and not really man, in that case, you are falling into a different heresy. Or if you believe man has no need for redemption, and in that case, everyone goes to heaven, then that you are believing a different heresy. That one's universalism. So these three questions really help to pinpoint how important this doctrine is. For example, if you ask a question, if you're dealing with something such as predestination, that doesn't really change who God is. That doesn't really, it's not a doctrine about who man is or who Christ is. Um, it doesn't affect the character or nature of these beings. So I think that's a very useful question to rank this important the importance of this doctrine of these doctrines.
Mm. Yeah, that's very good. You mentioned predestination in there. I think it's a good tie into secondary doctrines. And so here's what Gavin Ortland says about secondary doctrines on page 19. Second rank doctrines are urgent for the health and practice of the church, such that they frequently cause Christians to separate at the level of the local church, denomination, and or ministry. So yeah, second rank doctrines are more of here's what divides the churches. They're also unified under Christ, but it's urgent to where, hey, we need to be separated because we cannot all confess the same things within the same church. And so, when locating secondary doctrines, we should have wisdom and balance. These are not gospel issues, but they are important enough for denominational differences. They should influence how we understand the working out of the gospel and how we operate as a church. So some secondary doctrines are almost essential, and others almost tertiary. It's complex and wide, actually. They're not all equal. Similar to it's simple. Yeah, it's simpler to think of secondary as denominational and local church just because they're not all made equal. And so we need also an attitude of circumcision and circumspection and restraint. We have wisdom in finding these kinds of doctrines while also understanding their importance. And so some examples of this would be stuff like baptism, the Lord's Supper, how predestination works out, church government. And so even in those, like you could see, something like predestination maybe leaning more towards a third rank issue versus church government being more of a primary issue in the sense of it's like a higher up on the list because you know I I think honestly that Arminians and Calvinists could worship together. I think it'd be hard, but I think it'd be much easier than for an Episcopalian and a Congregationalist. And so that's what I'm
Mhm.
trying to say here. It's more in the spectrum. It is predestination might be lower than church government just because of how it practically works out. Not to say that Congregationalism is the one true form of church government, and that if anyone isn't Congregationalist, they're a heretic. That's what I'm saying. But I'm saying it's higher up on the list of secondary doctrines than something like predestination. And so I do think all these issues are worth dividing over, in the sense that we divide on the local level, not on the universal level. I don't think we should be calling the Arminians heretics, um, or the Paedo Baptist heretics. But I do think we should probably be best to divide from them at the local level, and denominational level slash traditional level, just because it makes us to where we can all confess the same truths and conform to those truths and not be nonconformists. So,
Yeah, and this is where a lot of the fights come up in
mhm.
more denominational issues. So, for example, as Hayden said, an Arminian and a Calvinist could worship each other, could worship with each other, not worship each other. That'd be heresy.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
in theory, because well, they still have if as long as they have similar views of church government, on baptism and
Mhm.
on the sacraments, the ordinances, as the Baptists call it, meaning the Lord's Supper and baptism. But they are worth dividing over, especially when the question of sin comes in. For example, I could not go to a church where the regulative principle of worship was not respected. And by that,
Mhm.
I mean a church where worship is not regulative, it is normative, meaning as long as scripture does not forbid it, it is allowed. Whereas my belief would say we are only to worship how we are commanded to worship. I think you see very serious consequences for worshiping how we are not to throughout scripture. There's the strange fire case. What was it? John MacArthur wrote a whole book on that one.
Yep.
So I would argue that I could not be a member of that kind of church for a long period of time, and I could not be a member of a non-Baptist church for a long period of time because of my convictions on how baptism ought to work. Um, and I do not believe, in the Paedo-Baptist view that infants ought to be baptized as well. So these are the issues that we divide over, but we will still call each other's brothers and sisters in Christ. So this is where wisdom comes into. We have to have that level of maturity where oftentimes we like to view them as the other denominations as these lesser beings, and we are the ones who are
Mhm.
enlightened.
Yeah.
When I think we need to have respect, but we also need to address the with the urgency that it is.
Mhm.
Um, I think I see some issues on both sides where uh, you see figures who will become a little bit too friendly around those who they disagree with on the secondary doctrines. And on the other hand, you have people who are willing to die on every hill, as if you aren't a part of my denomination, you are going to hell. And I do not think either of those, they both have their issues. And I think we need to have wisdom in how we battle these. Again, going back to why this is important to address them properly.
Mhm. It's good. Yeah, I do think that secondary doctrines are where I think a lot of the fights happen and stuff like that because it's more of the denominational stuff. But I feel like it's honestly a lot sadder to see when it's tertiary doctrines. And so
Mm,
let's get into that real quick. Tertiary doctrines are described in Gavin Nolan's book on page 19 as third-rank doctrines are important to the Christian theology, but not enough to justify separation or division amongst Christians. Fourth-rank doctrines are unimportant to our gospel witness and ministry collaboration. So these are doctrines not to divide over in any kind of way. They're important to talk about, yeah. Well, third rank are, fourth rank unimportant, but it's still not something we should big enough to divide over. Um, and you can think of fourth rank doctrines as like stuff like what color should the church carpet be, or what color should the stained glass windows be. Like this is just like unimportant. Like why are we even talking about this kind of stuff? But it's still stuff like you could talk about, like yeah, like what should our church carpet be? That's like a decision you kind of have to make, but it's not like one we should die on a hill for a red one or a blue one or whatever. Um, but third rank are you can think of stuff like the Millennium, the Creation Days. Let me think of some other ones.
Calvinism.
All right, yeah. Just stuff like that fall more into the third rank doctrines. Um, and so I think honestly, like this is the ones that it kind of saddens me the most to see, especially with the whole. Now I would say dispensationalism and covenantalism as a debate is probably more of a second because it kind of gets into how we look at the Bible as a whole, and so that like
Right.
that kind of is much more important. But I think dispensational premillennialism versus like amillennialism and a lot of the stuff that happens there, a lot of the tension and stuff that we see nowadays, it's like, oh, you're not a dispensational premill. So like, yeah, we did a whole episode on dispensationalism, but um I do think that's where we see a lot of the fights. And especially on creation, people like Answers in Genesis, I think take it too far. Um and I love Answers in Genesis. I think they do a lot of great stuff. I think they, point back to the Bible a lot and do a lot of stuff. I do think they fall more into I think they make it a bigger issue than it needs to be.
Right.
Um
They
in a lot of their works.
they
Go
take a
ahead.
tertiary doctrine and bring it to the point of secondary in the way they word
Hmm.
it. I
Yes.
think that's a common issue too that we see
Hmm.
among Christians. Like for example, the if let's say you have a brother who believes um, that the Earth wasn't actually made in 6 days, and maybe it was made over the course of a few thousand years, or over millions of years, or maybe billions.
Hmm.
I'm evolutionists don't believe the Earth was made over billions of years. That's the universe.
Yeah.
Let's say he does believe that he is still a brother in Christ. because he still believes the first doctrines. And you can point down the slippery slope and say, well, if you believe that, then you must not believe Genesis is real. And if you don't believe Genesis is real, you don't believe anything in Genesis.
Mm,
The slippery slope fallacy here is what causes tertiary doctrines to move all the way up to primary.
yeah.
There are people out there who believe that Calvinism is a separate religion. They believe Calvinism is a cult. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and part of this mindset is because you take a third rank doctrine and then you take it to illogical conclusions. If you want to point to a doctrine and say that, if you want to disagree with someone on a doctrine and point to its logical conclusion, you cannot immediately disclude someone from it because of the conclusion that you've come to. Well, I think that the Calvinism applies the same way it does in the days of creation, because people will often argue that if you believe God predestined people to be saved, then you must also believe that God um, actively creates evil in order for
Mm,
evil to. So he somehow finds pleasure out of creating evil, and therefore you believe in an evil God. Again, no Calvinist believes that.
mm-hmm.
That's taking Calvinism to its uh, illogical conclusion. The same with taking creationism to its evolution creationism to its illogical conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
You can disagree with on these things, and if you do believe that it leads down that slope, then don't hold someone accountable to that who doesn't actually believe the end result that you think they ought to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, show them, hey, uh, I disagree with that for its own reasons in and of itself. So we need to address tertiary doctrines really as they are, because when we do not, that's how you end up with entire ministries dedicated to opposing Calvinism, or entire ministries, or entire thought processes of people who go out dying on every hill, because every hill is not worth dying on. The hills that are worth dying on are ranked in the first rank doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that need to be defended the most above all. Those are the times when we need to unite with brothers and sisters who we may disagree with, in order for the sake of preserving the gospel, preserving the good news of Christ.
I think it's well put. Well put. Yeah. I don't know. I think I would probably put Calvinism maybe as a secondary, lower secondary, but that's probably just because of how much like it touches and spreads out. But I definitely could see it as an argument for tertiary for sure. I think it's definitely a lower secondary, high tertiary. Um, just because of how much it like touches and stuff like that. But yeah, like I definitely think, and this is just something you run into all the time. It's like, yes, if Calvinists believe that, you are completely right in calling it heresy and stuff like that. The problem is we don't believe that. And if we did, I think you would know about it. So, it's like whenever people say Calvinists believe this and it doesn't align with what Calvinists have said, it's not what Calvinists believe. So, but
You can
like
tell
in that,
this affects Hayden personally because he's had some debates with this.
oh my goodness. Yeah, yeah, like I always point back to, and I would say this about any doctrine, about any particular tradition. It's like if you want to know what they think, you look at what they've confessed throughout history. That's why a confession exists. It's what they believe. They put what all the pastors got together. They put everything they believe on a statement of faith and slapped it out. And they go, "Hey, if you want to be a part of our church, you would have to conform to this confession." And so if you want to know what Calvinists believe, you read Calvinist confessions. You don't read quotes of Calvinist authors out of context, or one miss off quotes and stuff like that. You read our confessions.
That's
Um,
strangely specific.
yeah, you could tell us that this is affecting me personally. So, but yeah, like, and back to like things like creation stuff like that. I definitely think that's a big one nowadays because, like I said, it's a slippery slope. They make it to be like, oh, you don't interpret Genesis literally. That means you don't interpret the whole Bible literally. It's like, no, let's talk to the people that don't interpret Genesis literally. And if they don't interpret the Bible literally, then yeah, you can say a lot of things about them. But
Exactly.
if they do, then you have to be honest with them. You would have to disagree, but you'd still have to call them a Christian, and you can't point to the slippery slope. And so I think that's just something Answers in Genesis misses sometimes. And I think if they didn't miss that, I think they'd be, a very, very, very strong, theologically strong ministry. Um, but I think that just because they missed that and they overemphasize some things, I do think it has really weighed it down in a way to where it's like, okay, well, how much of your claims can we really take seriously? Because you're saying, oh, if you don't take this literally, you're not gonna take this literally, you're not gonna take this like it's just a slippery slope. And so yeah, it affects how you work out when you make a tertiary, a high secondary, or even primary. So, but yeah, this is probably one of the more important ones is the tertiary doctrines, just because of you can know it's like if you make this big, you make it big. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it definitely is a waste of time too. Um, how
Hmm.
often do we see these debates just never end? There seems to be like no end in sight. And what do they profit at the end?
Hmm.
What really comes from it is hardly ever any fruit.
Yeah.
Um, of course, there are times when there is fruit, if the argument is done in good faith,
Yeah.
and if people have open minds.
Hmm.
But oftentimes, there's so much out there on how to deal with tertiary doctrines, and that there needs to be much more on defending the first rank doctrines.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think we should go ahead and talk about how this applies to
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
when we disagree with other Christians.
Hmm. Yeah. I think the first and most important thing is to assess the issues properly. We need to be acting with a proper urgency. And I think good ways to do that is by having humility. Let's be humble. Don't be condescending. Um, you think you know a lot until you don't. And so, you don't want to put yourself where you're not. Don't be in the cage stage for whatever doctrine it is. Um, and so work to build up the body with your conversations. Don't make yourself lord over everyone because, oh, I learned these things and now I'm gonna wave it above everybody. Like, no, no, like use these conversations to really build up the church. Like, even if you disagree, hey, let's find out where we disagree and let's see where we agree. Because, you know, Christians and people like to point a finger and go, oh, look, Christians, they can't even agree. We agree on 90 to 95% of things, and that's a lot. But yeah, the things we disagree on are big enough to where we have to, kind of be split off in the local, but we would still call the Presbyterian, the Lutheran, the Anglican,
Yeah,
people like that a
and
Christian. So
that number is inflated too. That's like if I said, if you had a, a political party, or a group of people who agree on one thing, and that's their main thing that they're defending, and then you all of a sudden start asking them what kind of coffee they like, and you say, "Look, see, I asked 100 different people, and I got 50 different answers on the coffee."
yeah.
Um, what really matters is, uh, sure, Christians do disagree on a lot, but we agree on what's important, and that top tier
Hmm.
right there is what matters much, much more than it has much, much more weight than what's at the bottom.
Exactly, exactly. I think another important thing is the history behind all these debates. We be humble. We're not the first people to debate insert doctrine, right? These debates have been going on throughout history between Christians, and so I think looking at the history of those debates really gives us a perspective. And I think we need to have a lot of love in this. They're not a part of the body, right? We're gonna love our brothers and sisters like they are family, and this should show in our debates. And they should be good faith debates that should show, hey, this is a family member, and we're walking through some disagreements, but we're doing it in a way to where I can say they're brother and sister, and they can say I'm a brother. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
listen to their points. Actually listen because of love, right? Be open-minded. Even if you disagree strongly, just listen them through and just see where they're coming from. Like I said, even if you don't think anything's gonna be changed or you're gonna stay in this position, just listen. I think another thing we need is kindness. We need to be gentle in our answers. Help to show them your side and how you came to it. Just things like this, right? Just a lot of good naturedness
mm,
in these debates because I feel like that's something that's missing in the body is we have all these bad natured debates and conversations.
and
Courage, stand firm. Yes, be open and be all this, but also stand firm in what you believe. Not in like stubbornness, but in conviction. Like I'm convicted of this. I'm gonna stand firm in this. Um, and so, especially on those primary doctrines, we should not be ashamed of those primary doctrines. Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation for all those who believe, the Jew first and also the Greek." That's Romans. And so just, be firm in those doctrines, especially in those primary ones, but um, in the secondary and tertiary, firm in a way of conviction, not in a way of stubbornness of, oh, well, I'm right, you're wrong kind of thing. Um,
right,
and I definitely think we need a lot of this in online discourse, especially. Online discourse is affecting our personal discourse. It's affecting how we talk to people in the real world. And typically that's not true, where it's like, oh, you're going to act differently online than you are in person. But nowadays, it's like we become so polarized online, it's transferred into the real world in a way to where things like shouting match debates and this all this ungood natured stuff of, oh, this is heresy, this is not heresy, this is all heresy, tribalism or minimalism has worked its way. It's become so normative on the online spaces that it's worked its way into real life. And I think we need to change this to help both our witness with unbelievers and our unity in the body and how we treat brothers and sisters. Um, so I would
Right.
say theological
And
triage is super important. Let's use it to rank the urgency of doctrines. Let's search the scriptures for wisdom and maintain a Christ-like attitude in discourse because this is super important. So, what do you have to add, Chris?
well, I mean, I would say adding on to the last part was, yeah, the age of the basement dwellers is really,
Mm,
it used to be the case where your online persona was vastly different from your real life persona within a lot of people. But there are some times when, because people's primary person is who they are online, we forget how to act, how we should act in person. I would just encourage people to go outside, touch grass, not argue online. It's a waste of time.
mm,
Um, and I will like to emphasize, if I had to emphasize one of your points, it's the kindness part. Okay.
mhm,
Because I've had a lot of disagreements with other believers before. And the only ones out of all of them that I've ever seen fruit come out of are the ones where I was kind.
mm,
Generally speaking, the kinder I was, the more open minded they were. And I've seen people who have completely changed their mind on the topic, um, with the biggest factor being how I treated them, not as some inferior, someone who was like a lesser being, a peasant in the eyes of a noble or something. I would
mhm,
come down to their level and say, I used to believe, I know where you're coming from. I see your thought process. I want to explain why I don't believe it. And let's talk through this together.
mhm,
Um, Out of all the disagreements, the ones where I've been kind have been the ones that, really change people. Those are the ones, because when we come at someone from an antagonistic standpoint, no one wants to be talked down to like they're a dog. No one wants to be treated as if they're lesser. But when you come to people and meet them where they are, you come to people from a very grounded sense, rather than acting like an entitled person. Then that's when you get to really see them open up. The defenses that are so often put up the second we come at them antagonistically are allowed to lower, and we're allowed to see eye to eye rather than simply poking jabs at each other in an endless debate. I would even go so far as to say you can be as convincing as you possibly want to be. Like you can provide the most convincing argument, but if your attitude is filled with anger, the stubbornness will kick in
mhm,
on both sides, and there will be so much pride that it'll blind the people to seeing the truth.
mm. Yeah, I think it's really good, Chris. Really good. All right. All right, sweet. Thank you for listening this far. We always appreciate when people listen to the show, make it all the way to the end. Thank you for still listening too. I mean, March has been our craziest month. I mean, we've been looking at the downloads. It's the highest downloads we've ever had in a month by a long shot. And so we appreciate all y'all coming in and listening and stuff like that, even though we, rarely put out stuff. But we got some good stuff coming out. We got some stuff in the pot we're cooking up. So yeah. Be sure to check out other podcasts like Solacast. Their motto is High Theology for the Average Man. Be sure to go check them out. Another good podcast is Hearts of the Lost. Their podcast on evangelism. If you want to learn more, check them out at heartsofthelost.com. They're also a ministry. Just check them out there. 412 Podcasting is my cousin's podcasting group. He seeks to make entertainment meaningful again. So he has a podcast on books and on movies. So be sure to go check him out there. He's got a lot of good stuff there as well. All right. You want to close this out with the verse, Chris?
Here we go. Ephesians 6:16. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. I want to say it's good to be back, but I feel like I've said that way too many times.
But guess what? Next thing you know, we're gonna upload like once in May, graduate, never upload again, and then we'll upload like 4 years from now, and be like, so we
Oh
forgot
yeah,
about the
so that was
pod.
what was that about? We're back, guys. We're back. It's been
We're
a
back,
while, but we're
guys.
back.
We're back.